So this is a presentation really in 4 parts, because if we're to do this to help young people flourish, I think first of all we need to understand what is wellbeing and why is it important in the school context. Secondly, we need to think about how it's been thought upon and conceptualised. But most importantly, I guess for you guys is, thinking about the implications of this for you as practitioners. As I understand it, you're people from different levels in school, so slightly different things you might take from this for your own roles. And finally, just to talk a little bit about some of the practicalities of things you can actually do to support young people's wellbeing in school. So those are the kind of 4 areas I'm going to cover in this talk. Okay, so let's get started. What's wellbeing and why is it important in school context? Of course, in this day and age with performativity and new liberal policies, neoliberalism, all of us tend to be judged on how well our young people achieve in school. So exam results are extremely important and indeed are important to young people's futures. So it could be questions, why do we even need to bother with wellbeing? And indeed, certainly in the UK, previous governments have on occasion suggested this may not be where we should be focusing our energies. So I want to try and persuade you today that in fact this is a really important area that we should be tackling. So let's start, I guess, with thinking about what health is. Now you might say, well, what's health got to do with wellbeing? But actually they're intrinsically related. So the World Health Organization, as long ago as 1948, and I feel they do not need to update this definition, talk about health as a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So, if we look at this definition, well-being is very much intrinsically related with health. And when we think of health, we might often think about having a cold or breaking a leg or that sort of thing. But actually, it's a much more holistic idea than that. And indeed, people have talked about this as being a biopsychosocial model. So it's about biology, psychology, and things to do with the social context within which we live. So being well is all of these things. So that's the first point I want to make about this. Think a little bit more about mental health and well-being. Again, the World Health Organization has defined mental health as being a state of well-being. So again, well-being is there, in which an individual realizes his or her own capabilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So again, this is quite a holistic idea, and well-being seems very central stage in this. But actually, well-being and mental health are not necessarily quite the same things, and there has been some discussion about what that would be. So there have been some people who talk about this being a dual continuum, and some people talk about it as a single continuum being that well-being and mental ill health being opposite ends of one continuum. But actually, as I said, some people have talked about this as being a dual continuum. So there's issues around mental health and mental well-being. I think it's important for practitioners to understand this distinction because it has slightly different implications for how we think about helping the young people in our schools. So if we think about it as a dual continuum, so the mental health or ill health is one aspect, and then you have mental well-being, which can be thought about as flourishing or not flourishing. So what I'm talking to you today about is really this idea of mental well-being as flourishing. If this was put on a single continuum, it would look a little bit like this. So you've got mental disorder or mental ill health down one end, which is the black part of this curve graph. At the other opposite end, you've got flourishing with various degrees of better or worse mental well-being in between. So you've got languishing, moderate mental health and flourishing. Now this is interesting because there is indeed some evidence to support the dual continuum model in that you can be languishing, you can have mental ill health but still have moderate mental health, and indeed a study dating back to 2002 suggests that about 1 in 6 people can have a mental illness but still be experiencing at least moderate levels of mental well-being. But you could equally have those who are languishing but who are not actually mentally ill. So this is this sort of dark grey bit towards the left, and that about 10% of people are thought to be in that area. So actually, as schools, what we probably want to do is think about moving everyone up. So those that are languishing towards more moderate mental health, and those in moderate mental health towards flourishing. Obviously, I don't want to sweep under the carpet in any sense people who are mentally ill, and they absolutely do require support. And indeed, you know, this is quite an issue in the UK. I'm just quoting some UK figures here from NHS, the National Health Service digital survey that came out towards the end of last year, suggests that 1 in 6 young people nowadays have a probable mental health disorder. And that's up from 1 in 9 about 3 or 4 years ago. So, you know, these people do need our help, and, you know, there are appropriate health model interventions one might make to support those, and these people do need professional services help, which probably is outside the scope of schools. You should be referring people like that onto specialist support services. But in terms of the sort of everyday well-being, there is still lots we can do as schools and practitioners to support young people's well-being, and really that's what I'm focusing on in this particular presentation. That's a mental disorder. Absolutely, we need to worry about these people, but specialist help. There's not enough people are flourishing. We want to make more people flourish. In fact, Hooper 2009 suggests something around 16% of adults are flourishing. Similar numbers of young people would fall into that category as well. And 1 in 6 young people flourishing is hardly a ringing endorsement, is it? We want to perhaps be doing more there. Okay, so that's the kind of distinction between well-being and mental health, which I think is quite important to have in mind. So if we're looking now at, and indeed the Good Childhood Report of 2018, I think sums it up quite nicely, saying positive subjective well-being is not simply the opposite of poor mental health. Children can be happy or unhappy with their lives, whether or not they have mental health difficulties. So that's kind of the take-home message about that. So now thinking about well-being, as I said right at the beginning, of course, you know, schools were often judged on, you know, are children getting the academic qualifications that they need? So why bother with it? Well, actually, there is actually now quite a lot of evidence that well-being is very much related to learning behaviours and learning outcomes in schools. So in other words, those with higher well-being are going to engage in better learning behaviours and have better learning outcomes. So let's just talk a little bit around this. So in terms of learning or learning behaviours, there's quite a lot of evidence now that those with better well-being actually are better motivated towards learning. So just to give you one study on that, in 2017 there was what's called a meta-analysis, which is where all the evidence is kind of put together in one study by Wilmington and Lindenbrink-Garcia, and they found actually they looked at well-being in terms of positive affect, self-esteem, test anxiety and negative affect. And they found those characteristics, so obviously in a positive way. So if you had higher positive affect but lower negative affect, this was linked with what they called adaptive motivational profiles. So they were looking at motivation from the perspective of something called goal theory, which basically means are students motivated towards learning, getting better at something, or are they motivated by looking good? Obviously the former is a more adaptive learning behaviour. So they were finding strong links between those aspects of well-being and achievement motivation. So clearly, if we want kids to do well in their exams, we want them to be learning effectively, and to do that, well-being is important. Similarly, in terms of engagement, so engagement's often thought about in terms of cognitive, affective and behavioural aspects. All three of those have been connected with well-being. So just to give a brief example here from the Good Childhood Report in 2018, they found that in their study, they were looking at well-being in terms of life satisfaction, overall life satisfaction, and they found that in terms of truancy, there was quite a difference between those who had high life satisfaction and whether they had truanted in the last 12 months from school, so less than 10%, compared to those who were low in life satisfaction. You know, over double of those children had truanted at least one day from school. These were 15-year-olds. So, you know, it does make, if they're not in school, clearly they're not learning and therefore not engaged, less likely to do well in their exams. So Well-being, or overall well-being, is very much connected with learning behaviours, but more than that, it's also related to achievement outcomes, both concurrently, i.e. how they're doing now, but also how they might do in the future. So a study in 2012 by Gutman and Forhouse, for instance, looked at the correlation between 4 types of well-being here: emotional well-being, behavioural well-being, social well-being, and what they called school well-being, and how they were actually doing in terms of, in the UK, national assessments. Here they were looking at the end of primary school, which is known as Key Stage 2 here, the middle of secondary school, so these are kids aged about 14 years old, and then the end of compulsory school, as was the case at the time, which was age 16. So what they found was, if you looked at kids in those key year groups and measured their well-being, there was a moderate correlation between well-being, all facets of it, and how they were performing in these national assessments. But perhaps more interestingly, they also then did a longitudinal element to this. So they followed up kids from age 7 through to the end of primary school, from 10 through to the middle of secondary school, and then from 12 up to 13 up to the end of secondary school, by measuring their well-being at the earlier stage and then looking at their achievement later on. And again, they found a moderate correlation between those things. And in fact, it was perhaps even stronger for some elements. For instance, about 0.3 correlation between behavioural well-being and achievement at Key Stage 4. So, it's not like these effects are just limited to that one point in time. They do have longer term consequences. And that's not the only study. A study in America looking at middle-aged adolescents and grade point average over school years, over 2 school years, found a very similar outcome. So, if we're focused on achievement, obviously, that is the main thing that schools are focused on in terms of their exam results. There is very clear evidence now, I think, that well-being does contribute to that. So, it's not like we can ignore this. It's really important to look at well-being. But equally, so that's looking at the sort of well-being and its impact on outcomes in terms of learning and school exams. But there's also a relationship between what happens in school and how kids feel about themselves. So a fairly early study, which was a bringing together of lots of literature from Solder and colleagues, suggested that if we look at kids' overall life satisfaction, it is associated quite strongly with how satisfied they feel about their school, how much support they feel they're getting from teachers, and interestingly, how competent they feel academically, or their self-efficacy. So that's how competent they feel to do what's in front of them there and then. So, what happens in school is also radiating out beyond school to their overall feelings of life. So this obviously straight away rings bells for practitioners. I think that, it's not just what's happening in school that's important, it's beyond school that we can have some impact upon. These next sort of group of things that have been found to be related to overall life satisfaction come from a large-scale international study. I don't know if you're perhaps all aware of what's called the PISA programme, the Programme of International Student Assessment, which is run by the OECD, which involves, lots and lots of different countries. So we're not talking about small numbers here. We're talking about, a large-scale study over many countries. And they found some interesting relationships between well-being and these factors. So, for instance, in terms of schoolwork-related anxiety, students who reported the highest level of anxiety also reported a level of life satisfaction 1.2 points lower on a 10-point scale than students who reported the lowest levels of anxiety. So that's quite a substantial difference. Similarly, in terms of whether these young people felt they were going to go on and complete further education, those who did expect to complete university education were 30% more likely than students without such expectations to report a high satisfaction with their life. So, given what we're trying to raise aspirations of young people, I think that's quite an important finding. The next thing I think is really important for how we can support young people in schools. So this is the relationship between feeling like an outsider at schools, not feeling you belong to that school institution. That again is very strongly related to people's overall life satisfaction. So here the suggestion is that the likelihood of reporting low satisfaction with life, so 4 or less on a scale of 1 to 10, there was a stronger relationship between feeling like an outsider at school and that. And they were 3 times more likely to report they were not satisfied with their life than those that were feeling a strong sense of belonging, a strong sense of not feeling like an outsider at school. So, 30% more is again quite substantial. And finally, in terms of bullying, 26% of frequently bullied students reported relatively low satisfaction with life, whereas only 10% of students who were not frequently bullied suggested they had low life satisfaction. So bullying, this is something that is a perennial issue, I think, in schools, and really strongly, that for those who are victims of bullying, has really massive consequences about how they feel, about their lives as a whole. So again, this is showing the importance of schools, not just to how they feel about school, but much beyond school and their whole lives. The final piece of evidence I wanted to flag up was a more recent study by Patalai and Fitzsimmons in 2016. And they were looking again at the relationship between, in this case, happiness, aggregated over a number of different areas of life, and various things, of which they found a strong correlation between those things and school connectedness. So similar to feeling like an outsider at the school, feeling connected to school. There's quite a lot of literature around this idea in the resilience world that shows that kids who feel connected to school, even if they're having quite a difficult time at home and outside of school, this can be quite a buffer for them. And again, not surprisingly then, in this study, that was also connected with well-being. And similarly, social relationships in this case, they were looking at spending time with friends, arguing or not with friends, and again, bullying. So these things all suggest that school has a really, really important place to play in terms of well-being that people feel about their lives as a whole. So I think I want to sum that up by saying that, we might feel pressured and buffered by the performativity culture in which we live, but actually well-being itself is and should be a legitimate aim of education. And this has been strongly argued in the literature, that it should be legitimate alongside things like equity, citizenship, economic prosperity and social cohesion. So, we need to create space for well-being around the table as educators, and try not to be just totally focused on them getting that grade in maths and English, for instance. And just to sort of conclude this section, really, is well-being really a problem? So I hope I've made a fairly strong argument for it's connected to learning behaviours that has consequences beyond the school context, but actually, is it a problem? This slide comes from the Good Childhood Report 2019, and it suggests here, this is a 20-point scale about overall life satisfaction, created from aggregating a number of different items on a questionnaire. And low life satisfaction is thought to be 10 or less. So you can see from this graph, the percentage of children who report quite low levels of life satisfaction, so 9, 8, 7, 6 and lower on this scale, is somewhere around 10% or thereabouts. Actually, that was the 2019 figure. It's interesting because of the pandemic. The equivalent figure for 2020, which has recently come out, is actually now 18%. So there are a number of young people who really aren't very satisfied with their lives. So, my argument about let's push that curve so we get more people flourishing, there is definitely work to be done. We shouldn't be complacent, although we have a small number of students here, 6%, who are very satisfied with their lives. That isn't the experience of a lot of young people. So there's much we can do. Okay, so we've made the argument for why it's important, and we've said a little bit in broad terms about what it might be. But let's drill down now a little bit more into what is this thing, well-being? Actually, it's quite a difficult thing, really. I mean, the words I've used so far in this presentation include mental well-being, emotional, social, affect, behavioural, life satisfaction, school satisfaction. So you can see in the field, lots of people are using slightly different terms, all of which are well-being. And indeed, it has been said by Ero and Whiting that it has what they call a holographic quality. It kind of looks solid. You think it's that business of being well, but when you approach it, it kind of fragments and disappears. So, I think this is quite a nice metaphor of the kids blindfolded touching the elephant. The one who touched the tusk at the front thinks it's a spiky, pointy thing. The one touching the tail at the back, it's a floppy, fluffy thing. The kid on the side touching the torso of the elephant thinks it's a big wall. And I think, this is part of the problem with it. We use this term fairly easily in everyday language, but actually when you kind of try and drill down to what it is, it's slightly more complicated than that. Part of this complexity, I think, comes from the fact that different disciplines have brought different perspectives on it. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about all of these, but I just want to kind of flag up, for instance, economists have often looked at it in terms of kind of objective terms, how many books does a kid have in their home and that sort of thing. Development studies, quite interesting writings from Sen and Nussbaum here around what they call a capabilities approach, which is looking at quality of life and, what things do we need in life to function a life with dignity. So that's another way of thinking about it. The social anthropologists have really looked at it in terms of community values, norms and resources. So for them, well-being is very much entrenched in everyday life and very context specific, which is worth thinking about from different parts of the world. The philosophers, going back to the ancient Greeks, have thought about, well, what constitutes a good life. Sociologists talk about it in terms of capital. But I'm going to focus mainly on what the psychologists have had to say about this, in particular, what's called the positive psychology movement. The reason for this being that actually in terms of young people's well-being, I would argue that they've done the most to try and flesh out what this looks like and what we can do to support it. So it's from the school's point of view, I think this is the most useful way forward. Now, the main contribution, I'd say, of positive psychology movement is to move away from this idea of trying to capture well-being in terms of objective indicators to actually focusing on the individual and their perceptions on their lives. So Dinah and Zuch, who Dinah's one of the big names in the field, has written that objective indicators, so if you think about how many books you have in your house, whether your parents were educated at university, and all those sorts of things that people often use, have they had a health issue in the last 12 years? Did they go to nursery school? These sorts of things. So these objective indicators may not accurately reflect people's experience of well-being. To understand individuals' experiential quality of well-being, it's appropriate to directly examine how that person feels about life in the context of his or her own standards. And those last three words are very important. Their standards. So it's not, you can be a poor person living in material circumstances that may not be that great compared to perhaps other people's contexts, but you can still be very happy in that context. Equally, you can be fabulously wealthy, but not very happy. So that's a very important contribution that psychologists have made. So taking this a bit further, I've mentioned this report several times already, the Good Childhood Report. In the UK, at least, I would say this is the most authoritative source of information we have on young people's wellbeing at the present time. It's a collaboration between the Children's Society and a team of researchers based at York University, who over, I should think, since at least 2007 have been looking at young people's well-being and now produce an annual report, which is published by the Children's Society. So this is always quite interesting when this comes out. And their model of well-being, which I'm presenting on this slide, looks complex, but we're going to break this down. A key distinction they are making is this idea from the ancient Greeks, distinguishing what's called hedonic well-being and eudaimonic well-being. So you see that in the two red boxes. So let's focus on hedonic well-being first. So this is the idea. It comes from hedonism, from Aristippus of Cyrene. Any Latin experts out there will probably Greek experts will probably criticise my pronunciation of that. But hedonism is the idea that pleasure is the sole good of life. So we have Bacchus here eating his grapes. So in defining hedonic well-being, it's usually talked about as subjective well-being, which has been defined as I put on the slide here, a broad category of phenomena which includes people's emotional responses, domain satisfactions, and global judgments of life satisfaction. So you'll see in terms of affect or emotional responses, global judgment of life satisfaction and domain satisfaction, which could include school. You get a sense here of these three components, and you can see why in the literature I cited earlier, some of these were being referred to. In talking about this idea of emotional responses, it's the idea that you have happiness predominates over more negative feelings. So it's not like well-being is always feeling happy, because clearly that's completely unrealistic, and indeed has been criticised, this idea of toxic positivity. You can't have people being happy all the time. I mean, life isn't like that, and you have some struggles in life, and that's a good thing. So it shouldn't be interpreted as being you have to feel happy all the time, but it's that sense of you have more happiness than negative feelings, and you feel happy in those domains which are important to you, and you have an overall sense of life satisfaction. So in terms of domain satisfactions, in the UK, this has been quite well researched, and you can see these on the slide here. And in fact, this comes from interviewing something like 8,000 young people and updating this on a fairly annual basis through this Good Childhood report. So the domains that we would want to capture young people's well-being on in the UK, I think, are quite well established. As you can see from here, they include things like school, friends, things we do, how we use our time, etc., etc. I think the takeaway message from here is that certainly works for the UK, and would be a good basis for kind of judging how well people are feeling about their, the important domains of their life. But in terms of different countries, different things may be important to them. So I've been involved, in fact, I was running a project in Kazakhstan looking at young people's well-being in Kazakhstan. And these 10 domains didn't quite pan out in the same way for them. There was much more focus, although health does appear on these domains, there was much more focus on health and environment and environmental affordances in their context. You've got to bear in mind they have really cold winters, it's minus 40 degrees, you can't go outside, it's too cold, and so forth. So, the young people we spoke to then had much more to say around that aspect of their lives than the young people in the UK. So when you're trying to get a sense of young people's well-being, it is important that you contextualise it to where they're living. And there's no guarantee, of course, that what we as adults think is important would be the same for young people. And again, Fattori's spoken quite a lot about it's really important we consult young people about this. Okay, so that's hedonic or subjective well-being. Let's now talk a little bit about the other branch of this diagram, which is the eudaimonic well-being. Now, this idea of eudaimonic well-being comes from Aristotle's work. And he talked in his work about living well-being, activity expressing virtue. More recently, philosophers have written about this in terms of recognising and living in accordance with the true self. So true self is daimon, eudaimonic. So that was Norton talking in the 70s. More recently, Waterman talks about personal expressiveness and self-realisation. So there's a sort of confluence around this idea of becoming or functioning well. But the problem with this is there's lots of different ways of thinking about this, and there's quite a number of different models that have been put forward. A recent article by Martella and Shelder suggested at least 45. So this is really quite tricky, and it's even more tricky when we start thinking about young people, because quite often the research has been with adults. So in the Good Childhood report, you will have seen under the red box, there was a sort of list of about 6 different things. This is actually a model by Carol Riff, which I'm putting up here. And you can see that, you know, the 6 domains that she talks about as being eudaimonic, which she calls psychological well-being, include purpose, meaning and purpose in life, mastery, relationships, growth, etc., etc. And that's her models put forward on the basis of, you know, an extensive review of different forms of literature, which are sort of alluded to in the broader outside bit of this picture, which I'm not going to go into, but I think it's important to focus on this idea of meaning and purpose and so forth. But the problem with this model by Riff is it doesn't actually seem to work terribly well for young people. A doctoral student of mine and I looked at Chinese adolescents, published a paper in 2018, to try and see if this 6-factor model worked for them, and it didn't. It didn't split up into those 6 different areas, quite a lot of overlap between them. So although the Good Childhood report does talk about eudaimonic well-being in terms of this model, it's the evidence is a little bit sketchy as to how good that is. So I just want to introduce you 2 other ways of looking at eudaimonic well-being that come from the motivation literature, so I think are very pertinent to the school context. They're also perhaps much more, there's much more evidence for their efficacy, particularly with young people. And I'll introduce also briefly one other model that tries to pull it together. So, what I want to talk about is something called self-determination theory. So this is a sort of an organistic theory of being and development, but has often been talked about as a model of intrinsic motivation. And the idea here is that we have will, a capacity to satisfy particular needs, and self-determination is our process for doing this. So we take action to kind of become a sort of integrated sense of self. So it's an active organistic theory. And the idea at the centre of this is that we have these core needs and we need them satisfied to become developed, in a sense. And in this series, although this idea of needs has a long history in motivation, going back to at least the 1930s, when Murray talked about 20 or so different needs we have as humans, in this model, it comes down to 3 needs. So we have a need for autonomy, a need for competence, and a need for relatedness. So hopefully that seems fairly obvious to be important in the classroom. You know, kids have a need to have some control over what they're doing, some autonomy. They have a need to feel competent about what they're doing in their schoolwork. They also have this need to feel related to that learning context. Initially, the theory was if you had all 3 of those needs met, it meant you would be intrinsically motivated. But that's been appropriated, I'd say, by the Wellbeing, the positive psychology movement, as now repurposes this idea. If you have those needs met, you will experience well-being. So I think that's quite a nice, neat model, and there's quite a lot of evidence for its efficacy. There's a web link there you can follow up if you're interested in that. A second way of thinking about, and again, it comes from the motivational literature, and it was a theory of intrinsic motivation in the first instance, is Csikszentmihalyi's idea around flow. And again, this might not be a new idea to you. It's the idea that you will experience flow, which he talks about as a state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience is so enjoyable that people continue doing it, even at great cost, for the sheer sake of doing it. So that idea, you lose track of time, you forget to eat, because you're just so absorbed in what you're doing. He looked at artists in the first instance to come up with this, but it has been applied very widely, including in school contexts. So to get that sort of optimal flow state, you need to have a sort of an optimal balance between the skill level that you have and the challenge you're doing. So you need to be doing something that's kind of just beyond what you think you can do, but you think you will be able to do it if you apply effort to it. If the the level of skill required is if the challenge is too high for your level of skill, then actually you're going to feel quite anxious. Equally, if it's if it's not challenging enough for you and you have high level of skill, you will be bored. So it's finding that happy balance in the classroom that's important. So initially, that was talked about as a theory of intrinsic motivation, has now been talked about as being the psychology of optimal experience. And again, I think it's quite a nice idea for teachers to think about in the context of schools. One thing I just wanted to pull together is, in terms of eudaimonic approaches, is Seligman's PERMA theory. So he talks about he's trying to bring together eudaimonic and hedonic approaches to well-being through this abbreviation PERMA, where P is positive emotions, E is engagement, R is around relationships, M for meaning, and A for accomplishment. So meaning and purpose, you can see that harks back to Riff's model. Accomplishment is around mastery. We've just been talking about that for Csikszentmihalyi's model and so forth. So it's quite a nice idea in terms of pulling it together. Again, there's quite a lot of useful resources, and I've put the web link on this slide. I think it does have some drawbacks in terms of it's not quite as comprehensive as some of the other ideas, and whether the evidence is there for young people is still something that's being developed, but nevertheless it's something that's quite useful, I think. So that's a whistle-stop tour of what is this thing wellbeing. So just summing that up, the first point is there are different ways of looking at wellbeing, coming particularly from different disciplinary perspectives. But I would argue that psychologists have probably done most to advance our understanding of this in terms of young people and young people learning in the school context. We do have to distinguish hedonic and eudaimonic aspects because they are different. One is about feeling well, one is about functioning well. There is, I would say, broad agreement now on what this thing hedonic wellbeing is. So that's, the balance of positive and negative effects and domain satisfaction and overall life satisfaction. The main thing for you to be thinking about there is, well, what are the relevant domains for young people in my context? I showed you what's important for young people in the UK. That may or may not be the same for where you are. But I suppose the area that needs most work in terms of the literature, and certainly makes it more difficult for teachers, is this idea of eudaimonic wellbeing, because although people agree it's important, we still haven't got clarification on the best way to look at this. There's a lot of different models, more evidence is needed. And I think each does suggest slightly different aspects that schools may focus on. So that moves us on to our next section, thinking about what the implications of these models are. Okay, so I know this is a whistle stop. Hopefully you'll be able to go back and look at the slides again to think about these models in more detail, but I'm just going to try and sum up. So the first point is, we're trying to move that curve across a little bit in schools. We're trying to move more people into the flourishing area and from languishing to moderately, I know on this slide it says moderate mental health, but moderate well-being. And we're trying to reduce the number of students languishing in our schools. So that, I think, is what our job as educators is to do. The next preamble I want to say is that we always need to think about well-being in context. I've already alluded to that in talking about the different domains. But there has been quite a critique of the psychology, the positive psychology movement in particular by sociologists for its failure really to think about an individual situated in a context. Much of those theories was looking at the individual and their resources. And the critique would be, of course, that, the individual doesn't always have control over everything that person does. So we need to think about the context and what we can do in the context to support that. I.e., we can't blame the young person for their well-being perceptions. We need to consider how we can support them. I think one way that's helpful to think about this is through Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems model, which I've put up in summary here. The idea of here is you've got the individual at the centre, and that individual's nested within a series of different systems. So the microsystem is those contexts the individual directly themselves interacts in. So for a child, they've got their home, they've got various community things they do, their family, but most importantly, they have their school, you know, and their classroom and their peers and teachers that they're directly interacting with. But those microsystems themselves interact. So, you know, there's the home-school interface and other aspects of those microsystems interact with each other. So that's the mesosystem. Then you have the exosystem, which are systems the individual's not directly part of, but still influences their world. So, you know, it could be school policies that are derived by governors, local authority, you know, these sorts of things. So that directly impacts upon their world. And then the outer system is the macro system, which is more around ideology, beliefs in society and so forth. So all of those systems interact with each other and of course change over time, which is the chrono element to them. So I suppose one way of just summing that up in a sense is, you know, this argument that the butterfly flaps its wings and that causes a storm on the other side of the world. You know, something that happens in one of these systems is going to have consequences for that individual at the centre of this ecological systems model. So, you know, as schools, we need to think about that. What are we doing in our bit of that system to influence, and how we impacted upon by the broader society in which we live to have an impact on the young person's well-being? So one element of that, perhaps to just flag up straight away, because this is something I think will be of interest to you, is this relationship between teacher well-being and student well-being. A relatively new field, but there's accumulating evidence now. I'm citing here a study from 2019 by Harding and colleagues, including Tamsin Ford, who's a psychiatry professor here at Cambridge. Quite a robust study. They were looking at teacher well-being, teacher mental health, student well-being, student mental health. They were looking at mental health from the teacher perspective in terms of depressive symptoms, and they also looked at teacher absence and something called teacher presenteeism, which is when a colleague attends work even though their performance at that workplace setting is being impacted negatively by an underlying health condition. So they measured that from the teacher perspective, and then from the student perspective, they looked at student well-being, and then also something called psychological difficulties, which they measured on something called the subscription questionnaire, which is quite well used. So the headline findings here were that better teacher well-being is associated with better student well-being and with lower student psychological difficulties. So we're absolutely clear about this. So students had, if the teacher wasn't experiencing good well-being, which they captured on something called the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, which is quite widely used. So if teachers aren't feeling well in that respect, it's going to have consequences for students. It's a correlational study, but you know, these two things go hand in hand. And also students are going to have less psychological difficulties, which include things like conduct disorder, difficulties with peers and that sort of thing. They also found that if teachers had lower depressive symptoms, that was also associated with better student well-being. So we talked earlier about this dual process model. So they were looking also at well-being and mental health. So both of these were connected with better student well-being. Finally, this idea of presenteeism, student presenteeism and student-teacher relationships were mediating factors in these relationships. So, in other words, if there was a good student-teacher relationship, that could buffer against if the teacher had low mental health, poor mental health, that sort of could partially break that link to the students then also being associated with worse student well-being. So it's crucial because teacher-student relationships are really crucial in this, and I can't emphasize that enough, that you know, this is the crux, I think, of what we can do in schools to support young people. You know, relationships are really important. That teacher well-being does have consequences, or at least there's an association with issues to do with student wellbeing. So we need to think about this, and obviously what's important for teachers is also going to be important for student wellbeing. So it's a tricky thing to deal with in our performativity culture, but it's important. Okay, so let's just summing up from the models I presented earlier about the different types of wellbeing. If we look at hedonic wellbeing, summing up the things that were related to that and how the implications this could have in terms of what we can do as schools to support them. And going back to the evidence I presented much earlier, it's clear that school connectedness, teacher support, peer relations, and things around competence, feelings of competence and self-efficacy, all of these impact upon hedonic well-being, so life satisfaction. So these are all things we can do something about. As I said, school connectedness is really important because it's a protective factor, a resilient, it can buffer against difficult things that are happening in young people's life. So we need to sort of work on how we can promote that idea of school connectedness. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I've also already talked about teacher support and relationships and peer relations in the classroom. I think, teachers obviously realise how important it is for students to work together, to have good relationships in schools in order to help young people. But by putting it there in this figure, I think it's helpful that, again, it sort of legitimises that it is worth spending time in schools promoting peer relations, looking at things like bullying in order to promote well-being, because ultimately this is going to have an impact on learning behaviours too. In terms of self-efficacy, just at this point to say that there are ways of promoting self-efficacy. So Bandura, who's perhaps the person who writes most on this topic, talks about 4 sources of self-efficacy. So one is having mastery experiences. So succeeding at stuff can promote one's sense that one can do things. Vicarious sources. So seeing other people succeed can actually make, especially if they're similar to you, so other kids in the class that are like them doing well can actually help them feel they can do it. Persuasion, so as a teacher persuading a young person that they can do this, that's important. And also affective states, so putting people into the right sort of mood and supporting how they feel positively about a learning situation, or reframing a learning situation so it is seen in a positive light. All of this can help promote self-efficacy. So if those sorts of things need to be tackled in order to promote hedonic well-being, I'd argue particularly the school connectedness, but even supporting peer relations, student and also teacher relationships. This requires really a whole school approach. So whilst individual teachers in their classrooms can definitely do stuff, I think it needs to be thought about in a slightly broader way. If we move on to the eudaimonic well-being, and again, I've just tried to pull together from those different theories the different aspects that are being talked about. So meaning and purpose, self-acceptance, growth, if we put all those sort of things together, that means it's important to talk to young people about their goals in life and helping them see how school can help to get them there. And perhaps that's something we don't always do enough of. I mean, teachers probably can think about times when they've had corridor conversations or at the beginning of lessons with young people. It's just factoring those in more frequently, I think. In terms of autonomy, we've already talked a bit about this. Giving the young people control over their learning. Yes, they've got to get through a particular curriculum, but giving them choices over the sorts of things they do, I think is really important. Mastery and skills and challenge, as I said, they kind of go together from Csikszentmihalyi's model. So it's about, ensuring young people know what the goal is for a particular task, tasks that are challenging for them, but believed to be doable. So it's this idea of the zone of proximal development. So I know talking to teachers, this might be very obvious, but it's reminding us that this is really important for well-being, and also giving feedback that's timely on how people are getting on, because it's quite difficult otherwise to know where you're going with stuff. So feedback, proximal feedback is really important. And then obviously, as I said, that last bit around relationships is absolutely key. some of the work I've done previously looking at creative partnerships, which was a UK government initiative to bring artists of all types, not just painters, but filmmakers and all sorts of artists into the classroom. I did an evaluation of this work to see how it impacted upon wellbeing. It was really quite interesting the way how artists had slightly different relationships with young people, perhaps because they felt they didn't have to be teachers. So they would quite often say things like they wouldn't condone something, but they didn't immediately tell someone off. They would try and show some empathy about how in their situation maybe they'd gone through something similar, but actually it wasn't a very good idea. So it was an interesting different social dynamic as to how the relationships worked in order to support the young person. I think that goes a long way to helping eudaimonic wellbeing. And all of this, of course, applies to teachers too. So as teachers, you should be looking at this thinking, how are my needs being supported? Am I getting the support I need that supports all these things? So, am I having opportunities for professional development, coaching and mentoring maybe? And I think this is a real problem when if we go back to this idea of the ecological systems, the macro system influence here. As teachers, we don't always feel a sense of autonomy about what we're doing. We can quite often feel as pawns, I think, at whim of the latest government thinking on X, Y, and Z. So, we need as institutions and as individual practitioners to find ways to support our own ways to wellbeing, because as we see, teacher wellbeing is very much linked to student wellbeing. So we need to consider both. So as much as you might be looking at this thinking of students, think of yourselves. Okay, so I've said quite a lot so far. I'm on to the last section and thinking about some of the practical things schools can do. I've talked about this a little bit abstractly so far. I just want to share one or two more practical things. So the first thing I'd say is you need to know what you're dealing with first. So there's an element of reconnaissance needed. So you might consider surveying young people in your context about their wellbeing, and there's lots of questionnaires that are possible that you could possibly use for this. I've mentioned the WebWebs one. I developed one for a project that I did for the creative partnership work. If anyone's interested, they're very welcome to ask me more about that. So find out what the situation is. Interestingly, in Denmark, now it's mandatory in schools to do an annual wellbeing survey and use that as the basis of, a school development plan. Can be problematic if it's put in that term, too much stick and not enough carrot in my view. But nevertheless, if you're trying to start off in your school, I think it's important to know what the issues are. And certainly in a coordinated partnership of schools in the faculty who are interested in working together on research, the super partnership, and we did something similar to this a few years ago. So you need to know what the issues are in your context. So questionnaire is one way of doing this, but I think it's also really very important to talk to individuals and groups, find out what's important. I mean, I'm thinking about this particularly from the point of view of student wellbeing, but of course this equally applies to staff wellbeing. So find out what's important and involve everyone in the ways forward. So if you're interested in supporting student wellbeing, you need to involve them in finding ways forward. It's not enough for us as adults just to talk to them and then unilaterally decide what we're doing. Voice and empowerment is a very important thing. It won't be authentic unless it involves them. The second thing I think we should consider, and I suppose I'm talking particularly to senior leaders who might be listening to this, it is really, really important to have a whole school policy and approach to this, rather than it being kind of bolt-on bits and pieces in different classrooms. So my suggestion is to become what's known as a health promoting school. So this is something the World Health Organization started talking about in the early 1990s, actually launched the programme in 1995 based on the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion in 1986. Remember that health in the World Health Organization definition is that kind of biopsychosocial thing of well-being. So it's not just, physical health. So I'm talking about health in an inclusive way here. So you could look at this idea So what they're trying to do with this, what a health promoting school does, is it constantly strengthens its capacity as a health setting for living, learning, and a healthy setting for living, learning and working, which seems a laudable aim. And it does this through various things such as fostering learning, health and learning, engaging everyone in the community. And when they say everyone, they mean everyone. So, we're talking everyone from the students to the people that support, who do the dinners, to teachers, senior leaders, but also people in the community beyond that. So we'd be talking about people like parents, health providers, community leaders, teaching unions, other educational stakeholders. So involve everyone. Provide opportunity for all members of that community. So that's staff as well as students. And have policies and practices that respect wellbeing and dignity. I actually think probably the most useful way to do this in a practical sense is to look at the Schools for Health in Europe network. It's called the SHE network. And they talk about having core values of equity, sustainability, inclusion, empowerment and democracy, which I don't think any of us would disagree or is a bad idea. And they have pillars that underpin their support, which include obviously a whole school approach, but also participation, quality, evidence, school and community. If you're interested in this, I'd really recommend you go and look at their website. They have a very comprehensive school manual for people who want to implement this sort of approach in their school, which is very practical. It talks about this 5-stage plan from getting started, assessing where you're at, planning, taking action, monitoring and evaluation. So kind of classic action research type cycle, really. But the manual also includes a whole raft of templates and sheets that are quite useful if you want to kind of implement this. So can't recommend this more highly, really. But also, so that's a whole school level. But if you're listening as an individual practitioner, apart from lobbying to get a whole school approach, what else might you do in your own classroom? As I said, it's best to have this integrated within a whole school approach, but equally, it doesn't mean you can't do stuff in your own classroom that's not going to be helpful. And here I share with you, there's lots of resources, but this one I particularly like. So Adrian Bethune is a practitioner in the UK who has written quite a number of books for primary schools primarily. However, I think the ideas he's promoting equally transferable to secondary classrooms. He has this nice poster for 10 ideas to create the happy classroom, which I list here. So I'm not going to talk about all of these in detail, but to say they are very much linked to the models that I've talked about earlier. So this idea, firstly, of creating a tribal classroom, for instance, is around school belonging, or in his case, he was thinking about classroom belonging. So it's about promoting inclusivity in relationships. So, having a team name for the class, making sure you greet the class as they come in, lots of storytelling to build community, and student bodies such as councils, school councils and so forth. He shared some nice, I heard him speak recently, he shared a nice collage he'd made in his classroom where everyone contributed a post-it note to what the team name meant to them. So, you can adapt those sorts of ideas. Being Still is around mindfulness. There's a trial going on in the UK at the moment run by the Anna Freud Centre into its efficacy. But again, there's quite a lot of accumulating evidence that mindfulness can really help well-being. This idea of cognitive reframing, thinking about what went well. I think as we have a sense quite often to focus on the negatives in life, and to kind of jig this into, what am I doing well at? What actually am I mastering? To kind of strengthen that idea of having those mastery experiences, getting kids to reflect at the end of the lesson on what went well. The idea of stretch, which is, links to the idea of flow. So having tasks that are just a bit challenging but doable to get people into the flow. Knowing your class, playing to their strengths, engaging their interests and so forth. Practicing kindness. Now, this is quite an interesting idea. And Adrian talked in his presentation about having It's Cool to Be Kind weeks, which I thought was a nice idea. He gave several examples. In one, he had the kids in his class who are near an underground station in London, went along to the underground station where the commuters were going to work, And there's 3 newspapers that are picked up by commuters. So the kids put little post-it notes in these newspapers to kind of cheer up people's days, and they sang along, and they had a whole massive cheer the commuters up idea. And actually commuters appreciated this, sent letters back to the school, and this really boosted the kids as well. But even without that boost, just getting involved and doing things, that this idea of connecting with others, I think does cheer people up, and it cheers you up too. Similarly, this year in the pandemic, he had them send their artwork to a local care home, and the people there who hadn't been able to see their families very much appreciated that. So feeling you're volunteering, you're giving, these are all ways to happiness. Be optimistic, get moving, obviously. Activity is, sound body, sound mind, etc. Is very important. But as a teacher, also walking the talk, and that can be easier said than done. So there are lots of little ideas. Well worth looking at his website. You can download this poster, and he has other ideas. And I suppose finally, we need to empower ourselves as well as the students. Again, this is a site that has quite a lot of resources on it, Action for Happiness. They suggest, first of all, we all take the pledge, which is I will try and create more happiness and less unhappiness in the world around me, which sounds a bit cheesy, but to try and embody that. They talk about the 10 keys to happier living, which again, I've downloaded this from their site, which if you take the first letter of each, it spells out great dream. Again, maybe a bit cheesy, but quite easy to remember, I think. And it's not saying anything very different to the sorts of things Adrian was talking about in the previous slides, or indeed what the theories we're talking about, but it just helps people focus in on the little things you can do. I particularly like the fact they have monthly calendars you can download. So they had Active April, Meaningful May, and now we're on to Joyful June. And on each day on the calendar, there's a little ditty of something you can do. So today, which is 7th of June, as we're recording this, it says, do something healthy that makes you feel good. So, sharing these sorts of things with yourself, but also your students, can be quite nice. There's an app you can use, which gives little messages every day. And in that network, there's lots of events going on. There's local groups you can join. And again, there's quite a lot of research. There is now some research evidence that these groups do support people's happiness. And all these practical ideas are premised on research, and you can, through the site, you can look through and click through to different research evidence that it's based on. Having looked at it myself, I think it's pretty sound, so I think it would be a reasonable thing to look at. Okay, so that's a whistle-stop tour through lots and lots of ideas. I hope I haven't bombarded you too much, but I think, the main thing to keep in mind is Eudaimonic and hedonic happiness are important, and there are things we can do to support both. It needs to be a whole school thing, but as individuals we can empower ourselves, our learners in our classrooms and ourselves, and it's really important we do that. Okay, thank you.